Welcome. I am Leena Lalwani, one of the engineering librarians. Welcome to Understanding the Publishing Process by our guest speaker, Jaylyn Kelley. Next slide, please. Zoom ground rules. Please use chat for your question and answers, and please keep your mics muted. Closed captions are available, and recording and slides will be shared in the next few days. Next slide. Today's agenda. Overview of the U of M library, and then we'll be doing the workshop with publishing choices, peer review, paper structure, submission guidelines, open access, IEEE resources for authors, and we'll end with Q&A. Next slide. Paul, Jamie, Joanna are your College of Engineering liaison librarians. Our liaison areas are marked under our names. If you do not know who your liaison librarian is, please email Engine Librarians and the right person will get back to you. Next slide. You can also make an appointment with us. It is mostly virtual. In recent days, you can select your department and the right liaison will show up. Please select the time and day to make your appointment and you will get a Zoom link. Next slide. If you are not with the College of Engineering, here is how you can find your liaison librarian for your department. Next slide. Now to our topic of the day. Understanding the publishing process by our guest speaker, Jaylyn Kelley. Jaylyn is an IEEE Client Service Manager with 13 years of experience providing training and support to IEEE institutional customers. Jaylyn is a librarian and has received a Master's of Library and Information Science from the University of Texas, Austin. Take it away, Jaylyn.
Thank you, Leena, and thank you all for being here today. As Leena mentioned, we're going to go through a few topics: publishing choices, peer review, paper structure, submission guidelines, open access, and then I'll show you some resources that will help you publish with IEEE. If you have any questions throughout today's session, feel free to put them into the chat box. So I can answer them, contextually at the time, but we'll also hopefully have time for a Q&A at the end. But the first question I always get is, where should I publish my paper? And IEEE is a large organization with 39 societies. We publish over 200 journals, and we sponsor close to 1,800 annual conferences each year. So before you decide where to publish, you first want to decide, do you want to do an IEEE journal article, a conference paper, or both? So a journal article is the fully developed presentation of your work and its final findings. So this means you're done all the research, it's completed, you're making your final findings, you're going to have clear conclusions, they're going to be supported by data. You're going to have like maybe 20 to 25 references, citations. Whereas a conference paper can be written while the research is ongoing. So this is a way for people to get their preliminary research out and then gain some informal feedback from the attendees that you can then use to further your research, to go back and help you. This is typically shorter than a journal article, maybe 4 pages in length, and maybe just a handful of references. And when you're thinking about presenting at a conference, there's a couple of things to keep in mind versus publishing in an IEEE journal. So IEEE journals are cited 3 times more often in patent filings than other publishers. Many IEEE journals have extremely high acceptance rates because a lot of people submit. So the more people who submit, the more papers are rejected. So it's not unusual for an IEEE journal to have a 10% acceptance rate, meaning 9 out of 10 papers submitted are rejected. Whereas with an IEEE conference, they're still recognized worldwide. There's a wide range of conferences to select from. But if the conference is in person only or requires the presenters to be in person, there is obviously a cost involved, right, to travel to that conference. So you have to keep that in mind. And if for some reason you are unable to present at the conference, maybe your plane was canceled, maybe you had a death in the family, maybe you were sick, whatever it is, as legitimate as that is, if no one was there to present the paper, not one of the co-authors, it will not be considered published and it won't appear on the IEEE Xplore digital library. And IEEE supports researchers in the evolution of their research, provided that the prior work is cited and differences are indicated. So you can take your your conference paper and later write a journal article. The key is you need something new to present, right? This new work must build upon the earlier work and have new findings to present. Rule of thumb at IEEE is typically that a paper should be about 60% different from the conference paper. And it's important to note that presentation at a conference is not considered prior publication, but publication in a conference proceedings does count as prior publication. So again, you need to cite it, explain the differences, and have something new to present. There are a few strategies to help you choose where to publish your article. So first, you can use the IEEE Publication Recommender, which analyzes your article and provides a custom list of recommended publications. Or you can run a keyword search in Xplore and see what are the top publications listed in the publication facet on the left-hand side of the page. Also, pay attention when you're doing your literature review. If certain journals are coming up over and over again in your citations, that's a clear indication that that might be where you need to publish your paper. But no matter how you make your selection, you want to be sure to read the aim and scope for that publication. Check out any calls for papers so you know what kind of papers they're actively soliciting, and check out the journal itself. Actually read articles from this journal. All of this will help you ensure your article is a good fit for that particular journal and that you understand the types of papers they're publishing, who their audience is. The better you understand these types of things, the more likely you will be to write a paper that's accepted by that publication. So the publication recommender, Paul has put the URL in the chat box, but you can see here, I've just done a quick, easy search on Internet of Things. I then see the top listed periodicals. There's also, if I scroll down, you see the top listed conferences. You can see I can compare these based on things like average submission time to publication, and you can see it varies pretty greatly. I can also compare impact factors and whether there's an open access option. And if I click on one of those titles, I get additional information, including the eigenfactor, the article influence score. Typically, you'll find editor-in-chief contact information, links to that particular journal's homepage, and you can even start the submission process right from here. And I'll go back just to point out that you are able to download the results or email the results. You can take them offline to do a little bit more exploring to determine which journal makes the most sense to publish in. But one last tip when identifying a journal to submit your paper to, be sure to go beyond the impact factor. That is just one way to measure a journal. Be sure to take into account the journal's reputation, who is on the editorial board and their reputation, and look at additional metrics like the eigen factor or even the number of patent citations. So next is peer review. And peer review is defined as the critical assessment of manuscripts submitted to publications by experts who are not part of the editorial staff. So peer review serves two key functions. They act as a filter to ensure that research is properly vetted before publication. And it also helps improve the quality of the article by providing constructive feedback and suggestions. I'd like to note that while I will be focusing specifically on peer review in journals during this presentation, because there's more of a variety in how conferences handle peer review, the basic premise of filtering submissions and improving quality before publication still applies to conferences as well. So how does the peer review process work? The first step when you submit a paper is that paper is going to go through a content match check using a system called the similarity check. And we're also going to ensure that none of the authors are on the IEEE prohibited authors list. And of course, plagiarism is using someone else's prior ideas, processes, results, or words without explicitly acknowledging the original source. Once the paper has gone through the content match check, it is then given to the editor-in-chief. The editor-in-chief ensures that the paper is in scope for the journal. So if your paper happens to be out of scope, because at IEEE we have a very narrow definition in many cases, there are so many different societies and so many different publications. The rule at IEEE is if your paper is clearly in scope for another IEEE publication, it must be rejected and referred to that other publication. So typically, the editors are really good about helping you transfer your paper to the correct place. But if they determine it is in scope for their particular journal, they're going to assign it to an associate editor. And that associate editor is going to assign it to multiple peer reviewers. We're hoping to get 3, but 2 is the minimum. Peer reviewers, which are the cornerstone of the scholarly peer review process, will have to find time in their regular day-to-day life. So they have jobs, they have families, they have hobbies, they have a life. And so sometimes people get a little frustrated by the length that it takes, the time it takes to go through peer review. Just remember, everyone's volunteering their time here. But the peer reviewers will then read your paper and send their comments back to the editor. And that associate editor then makes a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. And it's the editor-in-chief who makes the final decision and informs the corresponding author. Make sure your corresponding author is submitting with an email address they will have for some time, because peer review process and going back and forth can take some time. And it's not unusual for our editors-in-chief to get bounce backs from their emails. Somewhere like 7% of emails that they send out to corresponding authors bounce back. But the different recommendations are accept, and it can be accept as is, which is really unusual in this field, so don't expect that. Or it can be accept with minor corrections or accept with major corrections. So in those cases, we're saying we're going to publish your paper, but first you must make these lists of changes. You can also get a revise and resubmit, which is where we do see some value in your paper, but it needs some more work. So we're going to share with you our feedback and encourage you to go back, work some more on your research, your paper, and then start that submission process all over again. But we're not promising that we will publish your paper. And then there's outright rejection. In that case, we are not encouraging you to resubmit the paper to IEEE. So when selecting a target publication, it's important to kind of keep in mind what the publication editors and reviewers are looking for. As I mentioned, does the article's topic fit in the publication? So really make sure you understand the scope. Is the reported methods and rationale valid? Is it accompanied by appropriate supporting data and references? Are the data and results interpreted appropriately? And do they feel like the study was well designed? Novelty is huge. Everything we publish should be new and novel. So this is original material distinct from previous publications, your own publications, but other people's publications as well. How important or significant is this problem? Are the results new? Are they contributing to the field? And so one of the ways they look at this is by making sure your literature review is adequate and up to date. So it's really important to do a nice, thorough literature review. They're also going to look at the clarity. You know, are your ideas expressed clearly, concisely? Do the results stand out on their own without being overly preliminary or speculative? Interest. Will the people who are the audience for this publication be interested in reading this paper? And have you met all of the submission requirements? So being compliant is important here. You know, one of the things that is really interesting is that a lot of reviewers go into the peer review process looking for weaknesses in a paper that may result in its rejection. So you don't want to make it easy for them. You want to be really careful. You want to make sure that if there is another paper by you or one of your co-authors that is similar to that paper, that it is cited and referenced, and that you explain the distinction between the two. If the idea is not novel or it is rather just an obvious incremental variation over prior work, that's going to result in a rejection. Results must be state of the art. One of the biggest things when I ask peer reviewers why do you reject papers is they tell me unsupported claims made in the paper. So if you make a claim somewhere in the paper, you must back it up. A couple of other things that I hear is that the method or device was not fully explained, or that they didn't feel that the results were verified through careful measurements or simulations. So let's say that you're an author and you just received a revision decision, meaning your paper's been accepted, but you must make the list of changes provided. So first thing you want to do is read that decision email in full. So you're going to look at the editor's comments, the reviewer's comments, the instructions on how to submit your revised version, and the deadline that you have to complete that revision. And I always tell people, after you've read the comments, sleep on it a couple of days, because you put a lot of heart and soul and effort into writing this paper, and sometimes it's hard to take criticism after you've worked so hard. So give it some time to settle in and then come back to it. So after you've digested that decision, you want to determine if you actually want to revise the article, because of course, you know, it's not required. You could choose to submit your paper to a different journal or go a different route. But to make this decision, make sure you feel like you'll be able to make the changes requested, and that way your paper will be accepted. Is everybody, all the co-authors on board, and can you most importantly meet the deadline? If you are ready to revise, obviously you're going to need to obtain any additional materials you need. You're going to need to manage your file versions. This is a huge thing. Authors very often get confused and accidentally submit the wrong version. So make sure you, and if you have any co-authors, have come up with an agreed plan for how to manage file versioning and file naming. And then you're going to want to start a response to reviewers document. Okay, so this is a file that you upload along with your revised article. I like to think of it as a business letter, so you want to be formal and polite. And in it, I think the easiest thing to do is to literally list out all of the comments from the peer reviewers and a bulleted list. And so it's got their comment and then your response, their comment and your response. So a couple of tips: you want to keep an open mind, go into the process with the understanding that you're probably going to have to do a couple of back and forths so that you won't get frustrated. If you know that up front, it'll make it less frustrating for you. Also, keep an open mind to the idea that their recommendations are going to make your paper better. And remember, it's your job to explain your research fully. So a lot of times authors tell me, well, they misunderstood my paper. But if, you know, the associate editor and the peer reviewers all misunderstood your paper, that's an indication that maybe you haven't explained your research clearly enough, right? There's something in the way you explained it that's confusing. As I mentioned, you want to write this, you know, business letter, make it clear and well organized. You're going to implement the suggestions when possible, but if you don't, you need to give a reason why. So don't skip a comment from the reviewers. Respond to every comment saying, I made this adjustment, and tell them where you made it in the paper so they can flip over to it easily. Or you didn't make this, take this suggestion and explain fully why. In some cases, it can be because you got conflicting feedback from two of the reviewers. Sometimes that happens. And I often get asked how to become a peer reviewer. You know, just think about that if you're interested. One of the best ways to do it for grad students is to talk to your faculty advisor. They're very often involved in conferences, and that's how you can get your foot in the door. But in the submission process, there's a way to create an account and add your keywords for your expertise so that associate editors can then search and find you when they're looking for peer reviewers. And of course, you can always go directly to the editor if you want. All right, so before you begin writing your paper, I suggest drafting an outline and include, you know, why, what, how, all the major questions, and organize your data by importance, not chronological. Invariably, you're gonna run out of space, to put everything in. So if you already have it organized by importance, you don't have to make a decision about what's not gonna make it. It's also extremely helpful if you're co-authoring, because then everybody's on the same page before you begin writing the paper. Also, I encourage you to choose a journal or conference as early in the process as possible, so that you can read and follow the guidelines. You can use their template. You can understand how papers that are published in that particular journal are positioned, so that you can position your paper accordingly for the appropriate audience. And just remember, you're telling a story. This is not a big data dump, right? You have to explain what's going on and tell a story in your paper. So the first thing people see is the title. And an effective title should grab the reader's attention and let the reader know if that article is relevant to them. So I always say, think about what you would search for if you were searching for your paper. So maybe take a step back and think about, what did you search when you were doing your literature review, and incorporate some of those keywords into your title. But basically what you're doing is describing the content of your paper using the fewest possible words. So here's an example of a good title: a human expert-based approach to electrical peak demand management. And a not so good title: a better approach of managing environmental and energy sustainability via a study of different methods of electric load forecasting. That is a very wordy title. It's not really clear. It's got words that are unimportant and subjective words like better. So avoid those, particularly avoid new and novel, as everything we submit should be new and novel. Now, the abstract should summarize your research, your results, and your conclusions in 250 words or less. So I suggest just starting by writing the abstracts without thinking about the length. Just write it and then edit it down to the 250 words. The abstract should be self-contained, so there shouldn't be any references, equations, or abbreviations in it. And as you write your abstract, be sure to include your motivation, So what was your purpose in doing this research? Why did you choose this subject? Why is it interesting to you? Ask yourself about your approach. You want to make sure you clearly mention the methodology you used in the abstract, and of course your findings. So provide information on the answer to your research question and whether or not your hypothesis was supported or not. And don't use vague language. Actually provide actual results in that abstract. At the end of the day, the abstract acts as an advertisement for your paper, and you want to provide enough details to make the reader want to learn more. And we can share these slides with anyone who wants, because we do have a good and not so good abstract that you can compare as well. But again, think about your future reader. The title and abstract are the parts of an article that help readers decide if they will continue reading what you've written in more detail. So it's not unusual for somebody to spend as much as a third of their writing time, particularly if you're a newer author, just working on the abstract. And when you're crafting your title and abstract, remember, you want to use keywords and phrases that you would use to conduct a search on your topic. Think about synonyms as well as both broader and narrower terms that capture what your paper is about, so that regardless of how somebody searches, they're still going to find it. In this particular example here, you can see on the page, they use the broad phrase deep learning, but also have some narrow phrases in there, such as data-driven models and artificial neural networks. So after the abstract is the introduction. And the introduction is how you give context to your paper. You're going to get the reader to care about the topic and bring them up to speed on why this topic is important. And you want to make it clear that there is a knowledge gap, clear between what is known and what is unknown, and get the reader curious about what's missing there and how your research is going to address that knowledge gap. So in the introduction, you need to describe what question you're trying to answer with your research and why you're asking that question. So be sure to include a paragraph stating the problem and its importance. And as you explain what your work is trying to achieve, be sure to provide a perspective consistent with the nature of the journal. It's tempting to reuse an introduction from a similar research study, but each paper should present something new and have a unique motivation. And thus, it needs to have a unique introduction. The introduction will also include your literature review, right? So this is how you position your paper in the field and show the novelty of your research. And the introduction is about 2 pages in length typically. So that can be a third or a fourth of your paper. A pretty important section. And I've actually had peer reviewers tell me that by the time they finish the introduction, they have a pretty good idea already if they're going to reject or recommend submitting the paper. Next is the methodology. And in the methodology, you're going to just give a straightforward description of what you did. So this can be your code, your computations, your algorithms, your simulations, analytical methods, laboratory experiment, whatever it is that you did, you want to be able to describe it. For me personally, this is actually where I start my paper. If I'm writing a paper, I'm sitting looking at a blank screen, and I can usually sit down and describe what I did, right? My methodology. And again, like the introduction, you want to avoid copying from previous publication. Even if you follow the exact same methodology, you need to rephrase the description to make it different from previous publications. So this is something that falls under plagiarism. You can actually do self-plagiarism where you plagiarized yourself, basically. And, previously published procedures don't need to be described in detail. You can reference it or submit some supplemental materials. So, for example, If you are writing some papers based on the research that you're doing for your, that you did for your thesis, in your thesis, you know, your methodology is going to be really long, where it can only be a couple of paragraphs in a paper. So you can actually reference and send people to read the thesis methodology to get the full details. And then in the results and discussion section, you want to summarize your data, highlight your main findings. Be sure to feature things that were unexpected. You want to include figures and tables as appropriate to help you illustrate your research. Communicating visually with a good figure or table can be a really effective way to illustrate a point. And it can be a lot easier to do than you can using the typed word. So tables are best when you want to use exact values, because that's the important thing, those individual numbers, whereas figures can show trends and other visual information. And make sure any kind of visualizations that you use have enough information that they can be understood by themselves. A lot of people open up a paper and literally scroll through and look at each of the figures, and that's one of the ways they decide whether they're going to read that paper. So those figures have to make sense to them, even if they haven't read your paper yet. And then in the discussion, you can interpret the results, explain what they mean, make sure the discussion corresponds to and complements the results, but don't just repeat the results, right? Also, don't ignore previous work that disagrees with yours. If you address it directly and explain why your results are correct or better, you're not going to get asked to do that by the peer reviewer, because they're definitely going to come back and ask for something like that. And then the conclusion should bring it all together. You're going to summarize the study and key findings, put your findings into context by reviewing other major studies on the same topic, explain the limitations of your research and how you tried to mitigate those limitations, and outline the implications and recommendations for moving forward. I get a lot of times people asking me, well, both the abstract and the conclusion are a summary. How do I differentiate them? And so I like to think about the reader. So the person reading your abstract has typically not read your paper, and this is they're trying to determine if that paper is relevant to them. So you're trying to grab their attention and pull them in. Whereas the person reading your conclusion has typically already read your paper and now is wanting you to provide concluding thoughts and answer the question, so what? So where do we go from here? What does this mean? And in the conclusion, it's really important to provide a clear justification for how your work advances the field, moves the research forward. Just a couple of quick tips to help you make your research more approachable and visible. You want to be sure to communicate clearly and concisely. There's no need to use big words. You want to make this accessible to as many people as possible. And you don't need to prove your intelligence by throwing around big words. Write it simply and clearly. Organize your materials logically so that people won't get lost when trying to read your paper. If English is not your first language, consider an English language editing service. And while you're at a university, you usually have writing centers that are freely available to you at your university. So take advantage of those resources while you have them. Think about using active words, simple voice. And once the paper is published, you want to have an elevator pitch that you can use to talk to people, right? So if you're not familiar with an elevator pitch, it kind of comes from the sales world. If you stepped into an elevator and the person you've been trying to reach to sell something to is standing there, could you explain quickly and easily in the time it takes to ride an elevator your sales pitch? So what you want to do is you want to have an elevator pitch so that you can quickly and easily discuss your research in like 30 to 60 seconds with people. So when you're networking, when you're talking to somebody on a webinar, whatever it is, you can very quickly get them up to speed on what your research entails. And then be sure to leverage social media to spread the word. So next we're going to talk about some of the submission guidelines. So this is a quick checklist to get ready for submitting your paper. First thing you want to do is just review all the guidelines for your target publication and ensure that you've met all of the requirements. You've used the template and you followed all their instructions. If you have multiple authors, you need to agree to who will serve as the authors of the article's corresponding author. You want to make sure you have all the files, the current versions that you want to submit ready. And if you don't have an open researcher and contributor ID or ORCID, you need to get one. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So multiple authors. Authors must agree on and designate a corresponding authors. This is the person that will do all of the correspondence between IEEE and that individual author, and it's their responsibility to inform the other authors of everything that's going on. The corresponding authors must get a list of the authors on the article, get consent from all of the authors to approve the final the final version and the submitted version. And they're supposed to keep the authors up to date. Regardless of who serves as a corresponding author, every author listed on an article shares responsibility for the content of that paper, though. And an author is an individual who meets all of these three criteria, so they've made a significant intellectual contribution to the work described. So that's the methodology, right? They contributed to writing or revising the article for intellectual content, not just to make sure there wasn't any typos. And they've approved the final version as accepted for publication. If somebody doesn't meet all of these requirements, but they helped with the paper in some way, or maybe they were assisted in the lab during an experiment or something, you can use the acknowledgement section to acknowledge and thank them. As I mentioned earlier, you will need an ORCID ID before you can submit a paper to IEEE. And this is a persistent, unique 16-digit identifier. So ORCID comes together from, it's a nonprofit group of publishers, academic libraries, etc. And basically you just go in and create an account in ORCID. It will then give you this unique ID that you can use across all publishers. And it basically removes any issues of disambiguating or differentiating you between another person of a same name, right? Or if you've changed your name over time, or just changed how you submitted papers with your name. Maybe you used the middle initial one time and didn't another time. Maybe you got married and changed your name, things like that. This removes all of that confusion. It also allows you to sort of take control of your online research profile. A lot of people create their account in ORCID. They put together a really nice profile, link all their previously published papers, and then include that in their signature file, on their LinkedIn profile, things like that. This can really help to just better recognition for you and increase discoverability of your research ultimately. And I always like to point out that you can only submit to one publication at a time. For new authors, sometimes they're not aware of this. You have to submit the article to the particular journal you're interested in, wait for the peer review process to be complete, and if they rejected your paper or did a revise and resubmit, then you can decide if you want to go to your second choice journal. But submitting a paper is really easy on that Publication Recommender and on the IEEE Xplore homepage. There, IEEE Xplore journal homepages. There's a link to submit a manuscript. We use Scholar One. Lots of other Publishers use it as too, and basically you're just going to set up a free account and then follow the steps. There's a form basically that you fill out to submit your paper. Unlike periodicals that are managed by IEEE, the process for submitting papers to IEEE sponsored conferences varies greatly. It's from conference to conference, and even year over year that could change. So even if you submitted to a certain conference 3 years in a row, they may have changed the process the 4th year because they have a new volunteer conference organizing committee or something. So you want to take a look at the call for papers for any particular conference you're interested in, and that will provide you with the submission and review dates, acceptable formats, if there's a template, presentation requirements, things like that. And you can search for a specific conference or search by a topic if you go to the Conferences and Events tab on the IEEE.org website. This is kind of the type of information you'll get with a link to the conference website. I did just want to briefly mention open access. So this is a really important topic. Open access is basically when an article is made freely available upon publication. So there's no subscription or pay-per-view fee required. This is in contrast to what's known as a traditional publication, in which to get the article, like on IEEE Xplore, you have to be part of an institutional subscription like you are at the University of Michigan, or you have to pay a fee to download the article. But open access articles are made freely available, for example, on IEEE Xplore for IEEE content. And this is done through an article processing charge, or APC, which is paid for by the author or the research funder. Open access articles may include different copyright or licensing agreements than the traditional publication. And so as an author or a co-author, you need to decide whether you're going to publish your research open access or not. And when you're thinking about that, just remember that there are what are known as predatory journals. These can be defined as one that takes advantage of the author pays open access model by accepting publication fees, but offering much lower levels of service than those you would get from a legitimate publication. This is a really hard thing sometimes to understand, because sometimes they make up very professional websites. Sometimes they put people on the list people as the editorial board, and these people are real people, well-known people, but they had no idea they were on this website. So, you know, you have to really be careful when you're thinking about this. And when you do have questions, I'd encourage you to talk to the librarians that are on this call, because they can help you determine if it's a predatory journal or a legitimate journal. So it's always really good, if you want to publish open access, to start with a reputable publisher that's already known in many cases. And IEEE offers 3 open access options. We have our hybrid journals. So these are our traditional print journals. And basically, if you submit a paper to it, it goes through peer review. If it's been accepted, you will then be offered the option to make it open access or not. So it's totally up to you. However, we do have fully open access journals. If you submit to one of those, you're saying up front that you're going to pay the article processing charge, APC, if that article is accepted. Our fully open access journals still do a full peer review. We still reject quite a few articles. So it's not because you're willing to pay, it's just going to get published automatically. It still goes through the same process and rigorous review. And if you want to learn more about publishing open access with IEEE, you can go to open.ieee.org for that information. All right, so I wanted to just highlight a few resources. I'm not going to spend much time on this, so I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for a Q&A if anyone has any questions. But I highly encourage you to use the IEEE Author Center. It's at IEEEauthorcenter.ieee.org. And I'm sure Paul will be posting this URL. But basically here, that's where you can access that publication recommender. You can get the article templates and many, many other resources. So here's an example. When you come in, you can select at the top the type, whether you want to publish a journal, a conference, a book, a magazine, or there's a nice page for new authors that will show you some video tutorials, link you out to the author tools in the ethics section. But one of those tools you'll find in there is called the Reference Preparation Assistant. So after you've written your paper and put together your citations in the IEEE style, you can upload it to this tool here, and it will come back and tell you if the references have been formatted properly for IEEE style. And on that, IEEE Author Center is the best place to go to get the current version of the style manual. And really what you want to look at, though, is the IEEE reference guide, which is going to walk you through many, many variations of how to format whatever it is you're trying to do in the IEEE style. So this is just an example of a very generic book, conference proceeding, and journal article. But there's going to be multiple options based on what information you have for each type of publication in that reference guide. We also have an author's newsletter, so you can sign up for it. It's 6 times a year. It's really short and sweet, but it's a great way to get recommendations for how to publish, best practices and tips, and also let you know if anything new has changed with the IEEE publication policies. We also have Collaboratech, which is our social networking collaboration platform. And in it is an author lab, which is a place where authors, editors, peer reviewers can come together, have discussions, post questions, find corresponding authors. And so it's really interesting to just kind of go in there and read what other people have already asked in the past. And then, of course, for your literature review, IEEE Xplore, if you're an ECE or many other types of engineering majors, this is going to be one of your top resources to do your literature review. At the University of Michigan, you have a very robust IEEE Xplore subscription that gives you access to all the IEEE journals, conferences, standards, as well as select other content. And there's some slides in here about taking advantage of the free IEEE Xplore personal account. So after you come in and are authenticated with your institutional subscription, you can sign up for a free account, which will allow you to create search alerts, which is very important because remember, you want to cite the most recent and relevant papers on your topic. So you don't want to miss something new that's been published since you did your literature review. You also want to use facets to help you refine your search. So you'll see those facets along the left-hand side of the page. And one of these really helpful ones is the publication topics facet. It might give you ideas for how to narrow your research. But that publication title facet, for example, can also show you the top published journals for your topic. You can also change how your search results are sorted to find influential papers by sorting most cited by papers, or to find the most popular papers. And you can download citations from the search results page, use a feature called My Research Projects to keep track of your research, so you can kind of bookmark documents and take your own notes for that document. And when you're on the search results page, it's tempting to just click on the PDF and go, but I would encourage you to go to the full text HTML view because there's a lot of interesting and helpful information that will lead you to other relevant research. So for example, if an author has written something that's extremely relevant to you, I would encourage you to click on that author name to check out what else they have published on that topic. And you can even follow the author and set up an alert on them. References and citations will lead you to relevant research. And browsing keywords can help you refine your literature review and make you more aware of different terms that you might want to incorporate into your title and abstract to make it findable. You can also download figures from the page and even copy equations on the full text HTML view by getting the source code and highlighting and copying and pasting it. Most of these sites have already been tagged into the chat box. You can grab them. We also have some contacts for authors' questions, but a good place to start is at authors@IEEE.org. But you can see very specific author question areas here. And now I'd like to open it up and see if anyone has any questions for me.
Jaylyn, I have a question.
All right.
So is there a time difference in how soon a paper get approved by if it's not open access?
No, it varies greatly from journal to journal, but it's, well, I would say open access does tend to have a little bit quicker turnaround, primarily because we currently have fewer people submitting to them. So that's really the key difference, in my opinion, is that some journals just have so many papers submitted to them that it takes, a significant amount of time. And of course, if you're publishing in a hybrid journal, we don't even know that you're going to publish open access until you've already been approved, because we want to make sure that that's not influencing the peer review.
Hi, could I ask how many rewrites is typical, or how many revisions typically do you see?
So that's a really tough question too, because it really, really varies, particularly based on the level of the author. A new author will probably see 3 revision maybe rounds, where somebody who's a little more experienced and has published, quite a bit, it may only have 1 round of revisions.
Thank you.
Jaylyn, what is the APC average cost for IEEE?
So they again vary from title to title, but I think the average cost is around $1,700 now or $1,800. But there are some differences depending on the title you're submitting to. I actually believe also, though, the board, because we kept those the same for like 5 years, I do believe the board approved some increases for 2022, but they're always incremental when they do something like that. And speaking of, oh, yes.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, speaking of open access, if you publish with IEEE, you automatically have the rights to post your peer-reviewed version. It's the accepted version, I'm sorry. The accepted version of your paper, so that's the paper that's gone through peer review. The corresponding author will always be sent a link of that version and should share it with the authors. But you can post it on an institutional repository, which I'm assuming University of Michigan has. There's also options to post on preprint servers earlier in the process. There's a whole series of, guidelines based on where you are in the process of the paper, but you can share your paper.
What about posting on, because now all the grants require the NSF and NIH, can you post them at those repositories?
Yes, you can also post the accepted version on a funder's repository as well.
Any other questions?
So I would encourage you guys, if you do have questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me and I will get you in touch with the right person. That authors@IEEE.org email address is also really helpful when you get sent to an entire team whose job it is just to support authors at IEEE.
Thank you, Jaylyn. This was really interesting.